From the Sea, an Eagle, a review of 4 Ezra, 2nd Esdras. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me on another Cepher Academy, Cepher Publishing Group presentation taken from the Cepher Millennium Edition. Today, we're going to be looking at a particularly poignant prophecy, one that has kind of very much surprised me as I reviewed this prophecy. I've looked at this prophecy many, many times. And in looking at it, I've often wondered, what are they talking about? And however, I think I've come to a realization of what it is. And it's very interesting because this prophecy appears to have a timing in it that is so special, so unique, that it could only exist at one time in human history. And so before we start the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about that history. If you look back at the history of mankind, you see a number of things. We see the rising and falling of empires in particular. And it's funny how when we look at those empires and we count those empires, we can see that at one level there was an Egyptian empire, but the Egyptian empire was pretty much a territorial empire belonging somewhere, and I shouldn't say Egyptian, I mean to couch it as the empire of Mitzrayim. And the empire of Mitzrayim was pretty much couched around the northern end of the Nile River. A mysterious empire, to be sure, one that is marked with great pyramids and other very interesting landmarks. But this empire did not become an expansive empire until Yosef, of the tribe of Yasharel, the firstborn son of Rachel, the second wife of Yaakov. And Yosef, who was sold into captivity by his brothers, and in the sale was a mediation of whether or not they were going to kill him, frankly. But they elected instead to send him into captivity. And he, in captivity, having been wrongfully imprisoned on an accusation of rape, having been sold into slavery, nonetheless was able to rise to the second most powerful man in all of Mitzrayim. And during that period of time, he had interpreted a dream that had been given to the Pharaoh. And the dream consisted of a vision that the Pharaoh had seen, actually 2 visions, which Yosef determined meant 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And because he so carefully interpreted the dream, Pharaoh gave him control over the whole kingdom. And it was Yosef who sequestered wheat for 7 years into huge, huge barns, knowing that wheat would store for 10 years. If the wheat is unmilled, it will store for 10 years with no difficulty. And so he stored wheat, massive amounts of wheat. And as the famine set in, he sold some of that wheat to neighbors. And eventually he sold it to them for gold and then for their cattle. And then eventually for political control over their lands. And so by the end of the 7-year famine, the kingdom of Mitzrayim was a worldwide kingdom, to the extent that the world knew of itself, which recently we reviewed a map of the Roman Empire during Roman times. And that map was very, very revealing because they admit in that map what they know and what they don't know. And so there was literally a line drawn in the Atlantic Ocean, not far off the coast of Spain, because they had never ventured beyond the coast of Spain. They had gone up to the British Isles, they had gone down to the western coast of Africa, but everything else from there was unknown to the Romans. And it's the same as they went through the other side of the Red Sea. Most people don't know, but that before the Suez Canal, there was another canal that had been dug that connected the Nile to the Red Sea, what is now called Cairo, but at then was called Fortress Babylon. And interesting that they would call it Fortress Babylon, given what we now know about the true location of Babylon and about how true Babylon was just south of there. So what we see here is that the world did not have a great deal of knowledge, and the world was not fully populated. In fact, the world was not fully populated even when I was a child. My parents brought us up here to Alaska on a quest to go to the last frontier. And in fact, I believe it's still on the license plates here in Alaska, the last frontier. And there are other frontiers, I suppose. I suppose if you wanted to go out and explore the far eastern realm of Siberia, that would be a frontier. Some of the northwestern portions of China might be a frontier. There's portions in Central Africa that are a bit frontiery, or even in South Africa. But for the or in the Amazon jungle, maybe. But for the most part, the world is surveyed, populated, territorialized, and controlled by really overreaching governments now that control every aspect of our lives. And there is no place to go to escape the tyranny of the techno-fascists as they begin to exercise control over human life. Because there is no frontier, there is no place to go. Because there is no place to go, there is no possibility of ultimate freedom in the world remaining. However, when we go from the Mitzrayim Empire, the Mitzrayim Empire would collapse under the tutelage of Moshe, and Moshe would lead the house of Yasharel into the wilderness, and then the house of Yasharel would conquer the land of Canaan for the most part, and would begin to establish yet another kingdom, a kingdom of Solomon. And the kingdom of Solomon would become the greatest kingdom in the world. But this kingdom would fall into iniquity, and the blessings of Yah would no longer remain on that kingdom, and it would divide by civil war in one generation. And in just 14 generations, the kingdom would collapse, the monarchy would be done, the kings would be an exilarch kingship, and another kingdom would supplant it. And so one of the kingdoms we saw arise was the kingdom that had come to attack the northern flanks of the kingdom of Solomon, that was known as Yitzrayil. And this kingdom was called Ashur, or Ashashur. And this kingdom came against the northern kingdom and took it into captivity, dispersing the tribes elsewhere. These are the 10 lost tribes of the northern kingdom. And in 586 BC, the southern kingdom would also be routed and destroyed, Jerusalem being completely destroyed, and it would become a desolation. And the kingdom that would do that would be the successor to Assyria, and this would be Babylon. But even Babylon did not rule the whole world, neither did Assyria. And Babylon did not rule the whole world. And Babylon would be defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus, and then the Darius clan would take over, Darius would take over running the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Medo-Persian Empire would occupy more or less the populated areas, only to be defeated by that Macedonian Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, while he was busy conquering the civilized world, that is to say, where people lived, he would fall ill and die. And when he died, his kingdom broke into 4 discrete kingdoms: Cassandra, Lycamus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And so this occurred. Now, once these 4 kingdoms occurred, this more or less defeated the strength of the Greek Empire. And as a result, it would be supplanted by Rome. And Rome would present itself under the golden eagle with the symbol SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the population of Rome. And so this banner would march now again over the civilized world. And this banner, as it marched over the civilized world, would take up the area that was defined by that Roman map. In other words, they knew of Northern Africa. They knew of the continent of Europe. They knew of the Levant, and they knew somewhat of the coastlines of Iran, Pakistan, India, even to Indonesia, because there was commerce taking place at that point. But they knew nothing of North America, nothing of South America, nothing of Southern Africa, nothing of Greenland or Iceland for that matter. So you see that Rome did not occupy the whole world, but Rome would run into its problems because as it controlled most of civilization, and it didn't control all of civilization, half the world was dominated by the Parthian Empire. And Rome could not progress to the east of the Tigris-Euphrates rivers because the Parthians would not allow it. Well, this ultimately became a schism in Rome itself when Constantine, a child of York, the son of York, would come to dominate Rome as its Caesar and would move the capital from Rome to Constantinople. And in Constantinople, a schism began. And a schism began between the Eastern churches and the Eastern Rome and Western Rome. And ultimately, Western Rome would be kicked to the curb by Eastern Rome and looted by Eastern Rome. 2 generations after Constantine, this occurred. And so by the 4th century, Eastern Rome was ready to dispose of Western Rome. And Western Rome could not maintain itself, having hired mercenaries in order to defend its interests, the Goths having moved into the German area, and the Germans going down and burning Rome continually, one after another. And by the time we get to the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapses, having not controlled the whole world. And it only controlled the known world for a short period of time. Byzantium then would hold together, maintaining its control over the Levant and Northern Africa well into the 15th century and another 1,000 years beyond Western Rome. And while this happened, eventually in 1453, what was left of Byzantium, which at that time was only Constantinople, would finally collapse, and it would collapse, and its heir would be what we call Russia today. The depository of Eastern Orthodoxy and the strength of Byzantium and the successorship being passed from the last king of the Byzantine Empire's daughter, Zoe Paleolog, who would marry Ivan III of Russia, and the transfer of the sovereignty of the Byzantine Empire would move from Byzantium to Russia. And in the meantime, we've seen that in Western Rome, there is a regrouping and the idea of theological control to control the politics of the continent, instead of maintaining rule over the continent by force of arms. Instead, the church weaponized communion, weaponized heaven, and used its asserted control over things spiritual to govern the political class in Western Europe. Now, the point is that there was a schism that took place, and it's called the Great Schism in the 10th and the 11th century. That schism is still with us today, NATO facing off with Russia. That is to say, Western Rome facing off with Eastern Rome, again in a confrontation that broke out because Western Rome crossed over the Euphrates again to assault Byzantium. And as happened when Rome did that to the Parthian Empire, Rome was shocked to find out that the Parthians could fight back. So at no point during all of this has there been a singular world power, a singular authority, because the world, quite frankly, was not fully populated. The world did not become fully populated until the modern epoch. And we're talking about the redefinition following World War II, where every discrete area of the world, including Antarctica, has been delineated under a national interest. It is surveyed, it is territorialized, it is politicized, it is governed, it is controlled. This was not the case prior to World War I. There were many undefined areas in the world that were just kind of gently swept under the Ottoman Empire, under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This isn't the case anymore. So we come to a singular point in history. Now, when did this singular point in history occur? Well, when I was a child, we grew up in a thing called the Cold War. And the Cold War was a very interesting time because the United States, having been the only country on earth to utilize nuclear weapons in warfare, we succeeded in securing the unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan, following two nuclear devices being detonated over the two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then the military-industrial complex, which Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us of, would come to terrorize the American public, saying, well, the Russians have nuclear weapons that could nuke us at any time. Therefore, we used to do nuclear drills in first and second grade, hiding under our desks, covering our head in the event that there was some kind of a nuclear blast that went on. Of course, the nuclear blasts that were going on at that time weren't far from where we were in California because they were taking place in the desert in Nevada, where they had no problem touching off nuclear weapons above ground in tests and experiments. All right. Nonetheless, the Cold War was marked by this strict delineation, which was called the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain wasn't iron, and almost no place was it iron. But in Berlin, it was concrete. And there was a thing called the Berlin Wall, and it was ferociously guarded. And it was mostly guarded to keep East Germans from escaping East Germany into the West. And so guard dogs were deployed, a double level of guard was there, a double level of wall was there, lights, guard towers, etc. Now, if you got out of Berlin, then you would find that the Iron Curtain was primarily just a fence. A well-guarded fence, to be sure, but it was a fence that separated East from West. The schism, the successors to the Byzantine Empire from the successors of the Roman Empire. And this fence was very clearly delineated. Behind the fence was Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. And Yugoslavia was its own discrete nation, which was behind its own Iron Curtain, and Albania was its own discrete communist nation, even behind a greater Iron Curtain. This Iron Curtain was primarily imposed politically. No visa for you, no passport recognized. Okay. Now, in addition to the countries I mentioned that were called the Warsaw Pact states that were part of the Soviet Empire, they weren't part of the Soviet Union, but they were a treaty between those countries occupied by the Russians following World War II. In addition to that, Russia also maintained the Soviet Union, which included, as part of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Socialist republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarusia, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. All of these were SSRs. And if you look at the old maps during those days, they were marked in pink. The Soviet Union was always pink. Canada was pink, and the Soviet Union was always pink. And they would not delineate. You could not, unless you looked at the fine print, you could not tell where Ukraine began and Russia began. All right. So during this period of time, we had essentially a bipolar world. We were fed by the military-industrial complex the need to continually spend massive portions of our GDP on the military in order to defend from the quote-unquote Soviet threat. Now, we learned later, but it was much later, that the Soviet missiles that we were also afraid of, these ICBMs, really had no guidance system. And you can tell when you look at the Scuds that the Soviets had provided to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He had the missiles and he could point and shoot, but they had no real guidance system. And so they were going to hit somewhere, but who knows where. And so the theory was that if Russia pumped enough nuclear weapons into the United States, that they'd hit something eventually, right? Some part of the target. And this was the great threat of the Cold War. And so during the Cold War, the relations were very icy, but the world was very particularly a bipolar world. Under Richard Nixon now, Nixon, at the advice of Henry Kissinger, who I think was 100 years old when Nixon was president, so he's bordering on 190 now. These two gentlemen decided to play the China card. Now, China, at all material times, advanced as a communist nation on behalf of the United States State Department and the CIA that began to develop it as a communist nation under FDR. There was a man named Wallace who worked for FDR, who was constantly agitating and making sure that Mao Zedong had the funding from the United States discreetly to overthrow the existing government in China and create a communist power at the expense of Chiang Kai-shek, who we supposedly supported. Chiang Kai-shek ended up in Taiwan, and Mao Zedong ended up holding the nation of China under a communist enclave. The reason we wanted a communist enclave was really a banking decision, and because the banks wanted cheap labor. That's what they were looking for. That's why they created the quote unquote worker state. They tried to create it in Russia, but it was no effect because of the Cold War and because Russia locked itself down and would no longer cooperate with the West. As a result, we had to develop another communist nation where we could get cheap labor. And so that cheap labor was developed in communist China with American tax dollars at work by American intelligence agencies, who the same group, by the way, who engineered the Marxist overthrow of the Tsar in Russia. American bankers financing Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to create the rise of communism. The Soviets, who are our arch enemies, had factories built by them during the war by Ford and other major American companies, so that they could continue to build the war machine. So it's very interesting that we've been fighting ourselves. However, so something very interesting happens. Now, keep in mind that the Bolshevik Revolution began in 1917, but the Soviet Union was not created until December of 1922. At the completion of 70 years later, in December of 1991, the Soviet Union comes to an end because the famine of the word had ended in Russia. You must always remember that because the bankers, who are fundamentally the bankers are atheistic Talmudists, the bankers wanted an atheist nation. And they preached the doctrine of Marxism that said that religion is the opiate of the masses. And religion is the opiate of the masses. Okay, great. If it's the opiate of the masses, then what do you call Lenin on every street corner? So they replaced the true creator of the universe with Lenin as their god. And that's what happened with the rise of the Bolsheviks. And Stalin then, also a Talmudic atheist, and Trotsky, a Talmudic atheist, and Lenin, a Talmudic atheist, and the heads of the KGB and the GRU, all Talmudic atheists, began to impose political Talmudism on Russia, which we call communism. And this thing was a complete failure. And they deprived the nation of the word and its spirituality. There was a famine of the word for 70 years. And just as Jerusalem had been rendered desolate for 70 years, so the soul of Russia was rendered desolate for 70 years. So in December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, who may have had it right or may have had it wrong, either way, he had been running his two ideas of glasnost and perestroika. this idea of openness. And there came a day, December 26th to be exact, that they decided that they were broke, and the ruble completely collapsed, and the Soviet Union completely collapsed. And when the Soviet Union completely collapsed, the Warsaw state nations, namely Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, these nations became independent nations. And the nations that were the former Soviet socialist republics also became independent nations, whether they wanted it or not. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Asian states. They all became independent. Some of these states were hopelessly impoverished, like Georgia, for instance. Very poor nation, the poorest of all of the newly independent states of the Soviet Union. But when this happened, the instant that happened, December of 1992, this prophecy from the sea, an eagle, kicks in, because it is at that moment that the United States rises to a unipolar world as a singular superpower without a competitor. That's extremely important. So now when we get into this prophecy, I'm going to show you why it's important, and we're going to see how this prophecy unveils now as we look closer to it. All right. We're going to begin here in the book of 4 Ezra. We call it 4 Ezra at the Cepher, or the Cepher Ezra Reviy'iy, 4th Ezra. You might know it, and you might have it in one of your Bibles as 2 Esdras. 2 Esdras. Now, 2 Esdras was a canonized book. So 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras were canonized by the Roman Church. And by the way, only the Roman Church can canonize anything, because a canon is a Roman rule. So if you say something is canonized, that means Rome, mainly the Vatican, approved of it. Otherwise, it doesn't exist as a quote unquote canonized idea. But when Rome decided to canonize, and they did not canonize, as a lot of the liars try to tell you that they canonized as a result of the Council of Laodicea, which was never recognized as a bona fide council by Constantinople. And there were 7 other councils that were recognized, but the Council of Laodicea was not. The actual 18 canons of Laodicea do not include a roster of the books. That was addended to the council minutes later, much later. And so there was never an official roster of books in front of the Vatican throughout most of its tenure. There is the Moratorian fragment that is allegedly from the 5th century. It appears to be from the 5th century because of the form of Latin that was being used. And the Moratorian fragment gives the 27 books of the New Testament in order, but it says nothing about the Old Testament. It does say something about Paul leaving Rome and traveling to Spain, however, which is something Rome was denied. And there was a discussion between Pope Damasus and Eusebius, one of the great camouflage artists of history. Eusebius and Pope Damasus had an argument, Eusebius arguing in favor of the Tanakh limitations on the texts, and Damasus saying, we're not going to do that. We're going with the set of texts that have been given to us through the Septuagint and the work of Origen. All right, okay, great. Well, when does the argument result in canonization? Well, it isn't until much, much later. It isn't until Martin Luther attempts to redact the New Testament, moving it from 27 books to 23 books, because he didn't like the teaching of James. He didn't like the teaching of Peter 1 and 2, or 2 Peter. He didn't like Jude, and he did not like the book of Revelation. So he called those a New Testament apocrypha. And when he did, the church reaction was, Martin Luther, who's about to be excommunicated, does not get to determine what are the books of the canon. And so at the Council of Trent, in response to Martin Luther's canonization of a text. The Council of Trent in 1536 canonizes the text. And the text that they would canonize would become the same books that would appear in the 1539 Coverdale Great Bible, in the 1560 John Calvin Geneva Bible, and in the 1611 King James Authorized Version. That is to say, all of them included the Apocrypha, what we call the Apocrypha. The Catholic Church denoted those books as the canon and the Deuterocanon. And first Esdras and second Esdras were deuterocanonical books. They were canonized as part of the second canon, the Deuterocanon. Okay, so we got that kind of cleared up. So here we are in that book, 2 Esdras in your typical Bible that includes the Apocrypha, 4 Ezra in the Cepher. Then I saw a dream, and behold, there came up from the sea an eagle, which had 12 feathered wings and 3 heads. And I saw, and behold, she spread her wings over all the earth, and all the winds of the air blew on her and were gathered together. Okay, this prophecy immediately gives us our timing. Because why? It spread her wings over all the earth, and all the winds of the air blew on her and were gathered together. Now, the U.S. Constitution, I'm going to give you a passage from the U.S. Constitution. This is the endorsement at the end of the Constitution, which you don't find in a lot of copies on the internet, by the way. You have to look at the original text. Done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th in witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names. There were 12 signers to the U.S. Constitution in 1867. Why were there 12 signers? Because Rhode Island was not considered a colony. Rhode Island was considered kind of a prison farm, the plantation of Cecil Rhodes. And as a result, you see that the United States formed with 12 feathers. It formed with 12 feathers, okay? But what is a clear indication that we had a unipolar world where the wings of this eagle were spread over all the earth, and all the winds of the air blew on her and were gathered together. What is the proof that this, in fact, existed? Well, it's right there in 2020, called the pandemic. When the pandemic came about, for the first time in human history, every nation on earth acted in conformity. Every nation on earth acted in conformity. Now, I have to tell you, it's a sad thing that the nations of the earth would act in conformity predicated upon a giant fraud and hyped on fear. There were some nations which did not go along with this protocol, and their leaders were promptly murdered. And so, okay, the rest of the nations then agreed. And so you can go anywhere and you're going to see little stuff stuck on the airport floor. Make sure you social distance. Make sure you stand back, social distancing. As you guys know, I'm an anti-social distantarianist. I don't believe in social distancing. Particularly if you're going to do effective social distancing, it has to be at least 32 feet. I don't believe in masks because 93 million parts of a virus can pass between the fibers of an N95 mask. This is the results of Johns Hopkins University's study. Johns Hopkins University determined that quarantines, contact tracing, social distancing, and masks were all non-effective at having any deleterious effect on the spread of a virus. Okay, So I'm just quoting John. If the YouTube guys are listening, I'm quoting Johns Hopkins University. Okay, that's who I'm quoting. All right. So for the first time, we see the whole world act in uniformity and in conformity. The whole world acts in conformity. Okay. And where did the pandemic start? Well, it started in Everett, Washington, of course. And it started with the leadership of the great leader, the Lisp, Jay Inslee, who, when a guy came back from Wuhan with a little bit of a fever, they quarantined him for 2 weeks and let him go home, no problem. Then he determined that some of the people in the old folks' home who were suffering must have had the fatal virus, and the whole thing was on. Okay. The prophecy in this interpretation opens with the eagle of 12 feathered wings rising from the sea. In short, it takes its beginning with the rise of America, which begins with 12 colonies and states. And the eagle had 3 heads. Now, I thought about that for a little while. I'm thinking, well, what 3 heads does the eagle have? If this is the US, what 3 heads are we talking about? But here we are. You can see the 3 heads right here. These are the 3 obelisks of Egyptian authority projected over the 3 heads that actually govern the colonies of the United States. Anybody who thinks that the United States is governed by the US Congress is an absolute fool. No one in Congress who is elected is representing you. They don't care about you one iota because you didn't elect them, number one. Number two, you didn't pay for their campaign. And so as a consequence, you have no seat at the table with your congressman or your senator. The people who have the seat at the table with your congressman and senator are the people who paid for their election campaign and continue to fund their campaign in the future. And it's an amazing level of funding. I mean, you go from people who were waitresses to being worth tens of millions of dollars in just a few short years. It's phenomenal. But when you see the kind of policies that are being enacted, we know, for instance, that there's this group called the World Economic Forum. This is run by Klaus Schwab, a good friend of Donald Trump, by the way, also a good friend of Bill Gates and others, Emmanuel Macron, etc. Many people in the United States Congress and in the United States government are allegiant to the World Economic Forum, not to the United States. Many people in the US Congress have citizenship in Israel. The vast majority of the heads of the bureaucrats in this current administration that are governing things, because the current president is not, are also citizens of Israel. So anyone who thinks that we're being governed by the people, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, should have died before the Civil War, because no such thing exists in the United States. No such thing, period. How many of you voted on whether or not we should be funding the Ukraine war? Well, that's right, none of you did. How many of you voted on whether or not we should have a pandemic quarantine? Well, that's right, none of you did. How many of you voted on whether or not the WHO should have complete emergency authority over the United States? Well, that's right, none of us voted for that. How many of you people voted on chemtrails, that we should have chemtrails being sprayed over us? Nobody voted on that. Nobody voted on any of these things. The critical things that are going on with our lives, none of us voted on. But there are people who did vote on it. The bankers in the city of London, they voted on it. The Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the intelligence agencies, they voted on it. And of course, the Vatican, which doesn't vote, but takes its orders from Vicarius Filio Dei, the one who sits in place of the Son of God on earth. Vicarius Filio Dei. And Vicarius Filio Dei in 2015 articulated a Laudate Si that declared that Global warming was the number one crisis we had to deal with. Climate change is the number one crisis we had to deal with. And as a consequence, all of the things that we used to value, things like freedom, freedom of speech, rights, families, freedom to travel, autonomy, freedom of expression, freedom of association, all of those things have to be sacrificed in order for us to effectively fight the fact that it changes from summer to fall, from fall to winter, from winter to spring, and then back to summer. Because after all, we can see inordinate signs in the sun. I'm not sure how higher taxes are going to stop solar flares, but I guess somebody has an idea. Somebody claims we've got inordinate solar radiation hitting the earth. I don't see how higher taxes are going to affect that, but who knows, right? So we can see that there are three heads, and these three heads are, one is a financial head, the City of London. One is a military head, the City of Washington, D.C. And one is the spiritual head, the Vatican. Okay. These are the three heads of this eagle that rises over the sea. Now, I want to take just a minute and talk a little bit more about this eagle, because we see here, and many of you who are students of mine, if you're students at Cepher Academy, you know this history well. If you've been a visitor to this show, you know this history well. But I'm going to go through it again just quickly. Western Rome, when it fell in the 5th century, kind of regrouped as a theological control mechanism called the Catholic Church. It controlled the rulers in Western Europe. And one of those rulers, who was a true believer in Catholicism, was elevated to the position of emperor over a newly emerging Holy Roman Empire. This was Charlemagne in the year 800 AD. And Charlemagne, who could not read or write, became the ruler of the Second Roman Empire. The first Roman Empire having been the one created by Caesar Augustus, which collapsed in the 5th century, reformed in the 9th century as the Holy Roman Empire and the Second Rome, or in German, the Second Reich. And it would reign for over 1,000 years, 800 to 1817, only to be dispelled by the machinations of the atheist Corsican Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte imposed his code and so on and so forth, reformed Europe, brought it up to speed in terms of its legal code. And then Napoleon was defeated and France went to pot. And then, of course, we see the rise once again in the 20th century of the Roman Empire being called the Third Reich. The Third Reich, the Third Holy Roman Empire, this time brought and elevated by Adolf Hitler and his cronies. And they asserted and, in fact, did claim control over all of continental Europe. They obtained control over all continental Europe with the exception of the British Isles. Winston Churchill was anathema to the idea that there would be a swastika hanging on Buckingham Palace, and he resisted with the Commonwealth nations, mainly Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and some of the other Commonwealth nations. He resisted. However, the thing that defeated Rome and its approach to rule the whole world is when Rome once again attempted to cross the Euphrates to take on the Parthians, to once again cross the banner as Western Rome to make an assault on Eastern Rome in Russia. And so we see that the Third Reich made its fatal error in violating the Molotov-Trop agreement and the non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany, and they invaded Russia. This was a huge error on the part of Adolf Hitler, which he discovered later in the war, because again, having made the same mistake Rome made with Parthia, they were not expecting what they were going to get from the Eastern Empire, which was a bloody nose. And so even though the Russians lost 5 million people in the Battle of St. Petersburg and 5 million people in the Battle of Volgograd or Stalingrad and 5 million people in Kursk, for a total losses during the war of 16 million men, the Russians were able to push back the Germans substantially and to liberate Eastern Europe, liberating Poland, liberating Czechoslovakia, liberating Hungary, liberating Romania, liberating Bulgaria, liberating Yugoslavia, and all of these nation states, and pushing all the way to Berlin against the Nazis. In other words, they caused Western Rome to lose its tenancy over those areas. Now, when we get to Reagan, they pull back. But you have to remember that the Third Reich did not die. And the question that Nigel Farage asks in the UK is, I thought we won the war. Well, don't tell it to the EU, which is run by the heirs of the Third Reich. Don't tell it to the Vatican, which is run by heirs of the Third Reich. Don't tell it to NATO, which is run by heirs of the Third Reich. And we have allegiance to the Third Reich in the United States in the form of leading Democrats, but also leading Republicans. George H.W. Bush, always an adherent of the Reich, and his son George W. Bush, an adherent of the Reich. Trump was probably an adherent of the Reich, but we know that Biden is absolutely allegiant to the Reich, because as soon as he got elected, he flew to Rome and prostrated himself in front of the Pope. Now, this tells you where his allegiance is, and he claims to be, quote unquote, Catholic, as does Nancy Pelosi claim to be Catholic. And so you see these people in obeisance to the Reich, and the commitment of the military authority of the Reich is to assault and to impose the Reich as a world power, and to impose the Reich, and that the world power would grow for 1,000 years. And the premises of the Reich, now being run by Herr Klaus Schwab, who has set forth his plans with particularity. You will own nothing, and you will like it. Klaus Schwab. And the idea now is to create an absolute, perfect, techno-fascist dictatorship, and to subject every single human being to the worst kind of imprisoned servitude you can imagine under a social credit system in 15-minute digital prison cities, where every idea, every bite of food, every statement that comes out of your mouth is controlled, calculated, measured, and sanctioned, if not approved. So this was the approach that emerged in 2020. And in 2021, with the change of the presidency in the United States, the move to get this show on the road came underway. Time to take down the Eastern Empire and impose the Reich worldwide. And I beheld, and out of her feathers grew other contrary feathers, and they became little feathers and small, but her heads were at rest. The head in the midst was greater than the other, yet rested it with the remnant. Moreover, I beheld, and lo, the eagle flew with her feathers and rained upon the earth. You see this? The eagle flew with her feathers and rained upon the earth. Now, this is kind of an indication, too, if you will, a prophetic inference that the raining upon the earth is predicated upon air power, aerospace, aircraft, and over them that dwelt therein. And I saw that all things under heaven were subject unto her, and no man spoke against her, no, not one creature upon the earth. Because if you did, you were canceled. You were politically incorrect, and you needed to be canceled. Oh, you didn't agree with our protocol to accept a snake bite? Well, you shouldn't have any medical care. You should have your Social Security discontinued. You should be fired from your job. You should be kicked out of the military. You should be isolated among your social order. You should be blocked from ever visiting your family members in old folks' homes or in hospitals or in hospice care or whatever. You can't go see them. You should not be allowed to do anything. You should not be allowed to buy and sell. You should not be allowed to eat. You should not be allowed to participate. You should not be allowed to hold a job. No, you're going to be canceled. canceled. And lo, and I beheld the eagle rose up upon her talons and spoke to her feathers. Okay. So other contrary feathers, you can look at this in the United States as the subsequent 38 states, right? We had the 12 feathers, which I believe are the 12 initial colonies. Then the other 38 states, all of which are naturalized into the 12-state union and of a lower contrary status. Now, many people in America might think, oh, that's not true. Every state in the United States is on an equal status. That's patently false. It's absolutely false. You have three groups of states in the United States. You have the initial founding colonies, you have the conquered states of the South, and you have the acquired states of the West. And if you think that it's equality, then you tell me why 80% of Utah is a public park and there's not one national park in Virginia. There is more land locked up in federal land in Alaska. 2.5 times the size of California is locked up under federal control in the state of Alaska. 2.5 times the size of California. Show me that in Florida. Show me that in Georgia. Show me that in New York. Show me that. No, the 12 colonies have privileges and the acquired states do not. And the conquered states of the South do not. Okay. The head in the midst was greater. Now, this refers to one of the three heads, and it could be London. One of the three of them is dominant. It could be London, it could be DC, or it could be Rome. Now, if you ask the Rothschild family, they'll tell you, if I control the currency, I control everything. If you ask DC, they'll tell you, you can control everything, but we'll bomb you into oblivion. But if you ask Rome, Rome will say, I'm the one making the decision. I'm the one who wrote the Laudate Si. I'm the one who set forward this thing in motion. I'm the one who said we're going to address climate change by depopulating the earth. I'm the one who said these things, and you people are going to follow. So I am the titular head, even though the rest of you guys can do these other things. The eagle reigned upon the earth. In this interpretation, this prophecy begins in 1776, but becomes applicable when America would become the world's only superpower. That makes this prophecy particularly applicable in 1992. Now, according to Sam Ellis, Johnny Harris, and Zach Beauchamp, in their 2016 essay entitled How America Became a Superpower, explained in 8 minutes, from a colony to a superpower in 200 years, they say the following. The United States is the world's most powerful country by far, with a globe-spanning network of alliances and military bases. It's practically unrecognizable from the way the country began, and indeed what many early Americans thought it would be. The above video tells the story of how America changed from an insular former colony to a globe-spanning superpower. The United States was the only country to emerge from the war in strong economic and military shape, and thus was in a unique position to shape the terms of the peace. The result was a global financial system called Bretton Woods, aimed at coordinating the global economy and preventing another Great Depression, and the United Nations created to preserve the post-war peace. However, after we did this thing, and by the way, when you think about it, look, you know now if you go down to buy a car, you're going to be looking at several things. Now, in the 80s, you were looking at really three things. You were looking at either Japanese cars, Toyota, Nissan, Lexus, Acura, etc. Or you were looking at German cars, Audi, Volkswagen, Porsche, Mercedes, or you were looking at American cars. Very few people looked at the oil-leaking British cars, and so they were kind of off the table. So these were kind of your choices. But you have to remember, these were the choices prior to World War II as well. But we bombed into oblivion the German industrial capacity. And when it came to the end of the war with Japan, we hit their industrial capacity at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to set them back such that you were not going to see a good-looking Toyota until, well, I mean, that begs the question if there ever was a good-looking Toyota, really. But you're not going to see a good-looking Toyota until you get into the 1980s somewhere. The tin cans that were being sold in the 1960s were unbelievable. The engineering was there, but man, they were tin cans. And Same thing with the German cars. But once you see Germany has developed to a period of point that it becomes back on its feet again as its industrial might is returning, what do? You get Audis, you get Volkswagens, you get Porsches, you get Mercedes at a very high quality level and very competitive cars, right? And of course, you begin to see now the industrial capacity of Britain has returned to some degree, very limited degree, but to some degree. Most of the autos in Britain are now owned by Ford or GM. And, you see some French building, but the French cars are not important. You still have difficulties with the Italian cars, even though it's ironic that the Italian car Fiat has such a bad reputation, but Ferrari has such a good reputation, right? It's kind of ironic. And in the United States, what cars are being built here? Did you know that the only pickup truck built in the United States is the Toyota Tundra? It's built in Texas. Everything else is built offshore, right? So we emerged from the war in strong economic and military shape because we bombed the industrial capability in Europe and we bombed the industrial capability in Japan. Once they were able to rebuild, we had a competitive nightmare on our hands. All right. Now, the Bretton Woods system was completely abandoned by Richard Nixon in favor of the petrodollar. Now, the petrodollar was a corrupt, fraudulent notion that was done by a corrupt politician to allow him to inflate the dollar, to avoid the restrictions of reality, and to impose the will of the United States on the rest of the world in forcing them to transact in the dollar under the agreement that all of the OPEC nations, the oil-producing exporting countries, would be, in fact, selling their oil with the dollar. So all transactions were required to be done by the dollar, and the dollar became the international currency, not Bretton Woods. And when the dollar became the international currency, and when the United States had all of these military bases all over the world, and there was no competitor militarily, the United States became the sole singular superpower at the end of the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. And George Herbert Walker Bush had already pre-selected and had arranged for the presidency of Bill Clinton, the presidency of his son, George W. Bush, and the presidency of Barack Obama before he left the office in 1991. Competition with the Soviet Union led the United States to establish its first permanent major non-wartime alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It also led the United States to grow its military and political presence around the world in an effort to contain the spread of communism, leading to interventions in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia and South Korea. Okay, so we heard all this rhetoric when I was a young kid. We have to stop the spread of communism. Well, what is communism? Right? And if we had to stop the spread of communism, why are we a communist nation now? We're more of a communist nation than Russia is, or communist China is, for that matter. Much more. How'd that happen? Because the average American doesn't even know what communism is. And if you wanted to stop the spread of communism, maybe you should have kept the Marxists out of the universities. Oh, that's a door that we're going to leave wide open until every university professor is a Marxist, right? We're going to stop the spread of communism. Who spread it to begin with? The United States government and its banks. That's who spread it. And they spread it trying to create a worker class that could be exploited by American corporations. So what are you talking about, contain the spread of communism? You know, it was Robert McNamara that thought we were in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. Because after all, if Vietnam fell, then Cambodia, Laos, and Burma, and all these other places would become communist. And my response to that is, Robert, so what? So what? Who cares? Wasn't our business. But these guys had created the communist boogeyman. The communist boogeyman. A boogeyman, by the way, they created. A golem they created. And so when you see this, we have to stop the threat of communism. Well, that wasn't the issue at all. That wasn't the issue at all. It was just rhetoric to keep tax dollars coming so that we could engage in military intervention in order to fill the coffers of the intelligence agencies which at all material times were allegiant to Rome and not to the United States. Where do you think they fill these intelligence agencies? At the Jesuit training academies at Georgetown University in DC and at Boston. And thirdly, tertiarily from Notre Dame and other schools. But they're Jesuit academies that fill the intelligence agencies. And they're allegiant to Rome. So when you talk about Vietnam, what was Vietnam really about? The CIA funding itself by moving heroin out of the Golden Triangle. Since France couldn't control it anymore, the CIA elected to control it to keep Russia from controlling it. So what was the spread of communism they were really worried about? They were worried about Russia controlling the heroin traffic instead of the United States. That's the same reason, by the way, we entered into Afghanistan. Did anybody in Afghanistan participate in the downing of the buildings at 9/11? No, that was 13 of the 19 hijackers, according to the official story, were Saudi intelligence agents. So we invaded Afghanistan. See? You see the reasoning there? It's right there. You can see it very clearly. No, we went into Afghanistan in order to control and to take over the poppy fields and to control the heroin market, which we did. And it was all black budget funding for the intelligence agencies, none of whom are allegiant to the United States. So let's just put it where it is. Okay? The Soviet Union fell in December of 1991. The US could have chosen to withdraw from these alliances. Yeah, if the Soviet Union was gone and communist China was being developed as a trade partner, why did we need to have NATO again? If we were trying to protect ourselves from Soviet expansion, then what do you have to say when Poland becomes an independent nation and Czechoslovakia becomes an independent nation and Hungary becomes an independent nation? And even the border states that were former SSRs, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, even these border states become independent nations. So what are you talking about? Soviet threat? What are you talking about? Communist threat? What threat? There was no Soviet Union. How could you have a Soviet threat? How can you have that? Well, that doesn't mean we don't need to have NATO. We need to have NATO around to do things like what? Well, we have to provide humanitarian aid to Yugoslavia. What do you mean by that? Bombing them from 60,000 feet after we foment a civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like we're fomenting a civil war there right now in Kosovo. We need to bomb Libya. That guy Muammar Gaddafi is getting too rich. He's, rumor has it Gaddafi has gold. Okay, let's go bomb him and steal his gold. Good idea. What's your reasoning? Well, we don't have any reasoning yet. Okay, we'll send in some ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists to try to take over the country. And then when Gaddafi deploys troops to fight back, we'll call that a crime against humanity, and NATO has to intervene before he kills his own people. Oh, a great idea. Thanks, Hillary. We'll do that. Said the people who were saying yes to a woman who had sold $12 million worth of arms to ISIS directly through Benghazi. Oh, nobody wants to talk about Benghazi. Yeah. Hypocrisy at every level. Okay. So they conclude in their article, so here we are. The United States is the world's most connected and pivotal power and will remain so. That was published in 2016. Now, the United States then went on to exercise its political power worldwide with the enforcing of a pandemic. All right, let's get back to the prophecy. Watch not all at once. Sleep everyone in his own place and watch by course. This is the heads talking to the feathers now. Do not watch all at once. Sleep everyone in his own place and watch by course. This is telling you that this eagle occupies multiple time zones, right? Watch by course. Watch when you're awake. Multiple time zones. But let the heads be preserved for the last. And I beheld, and lo, the voice went not out of her heads, but from the midst of her body. In other words, the voice was going by popular opinion, right? And this is what we see, a pop culture dominating what's taking place in the political speech, in the real politic. It's being dominated by popular opinion. And I numbered her contrary feathers, and behold, there were 8 of them. That would be the BRICS nations, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. The BRICS nations. These nations are the cadre feathers. And I looked, and behold, on the right side, that would be a Republican, there arose one feather and reigned over all the earth. The first one to do this following the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991 would be George H.W. Bush. He would be the very first one to rule over the singular superpower of the United States in 1991, GHWB. And so it was that when it reigned, the end of it came, okay, his term ran out, and the place there appeared no more. He would never take power again. So the next following stood up and reigned. Now, it's not Bill Clinton we're talking about, because Bill Clinton was a drug-running captain for George Herbert Walker Bush. Many of you might not know that story, but since we're doing this, and I'm going to go in kind of off course here, I'm going to take the time to explain it to you. H.W. Bush, whose real name was George Scherf, born a German citizen and a Nazi, adopted by the Bush family with his father, took on the name George Herbert Walker Bush, Herbert Walker being the name of the man who owned Auschwitz in Poland. He became the head of the CIA following his successful orchestration of what took place in Daley Plaza in November of 1963, him being present right on the sidewalk in front of the car in which Kennedy was driving. Once that event had taken place, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who knew that the event was going to take place that day, elevated HWB to the head of the CIA in 1966. Now, this is where HWB sat. And when Richard Nixon took office in 1968, Nixon was intent upon continuing the war, but the United States was coming apart at the seams because no American wanted to be there to further the ego problem of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, and what Robert McNamara didn't understand, by the way, is that the Vietnamese didn't want to progress communism. The Vietnamese wanted an independent country free of colonization and were willing to sacrifice every single person in the country until they got it. When he finally understood that at the end of his life, it killed him, because he realized that he cost 55,000 American lives and 300,000 American casualties and millions of Vietnamese casualties on a brain-dead idea that was sold to him by a bunch of dogs, quite frankly. And the American public didn't want it. And so we had a counter-revolution taking place in the United States that threatened to take the whole nation apart, 1968 being the pinnacle of that year. Robert Kennedy, the father of RFK Jr., who's now running for president of the United States, was assassinated that year. Martin Luther King was assassinated that year. And there were multiple race riots in almost every major city in the country, fires burning everywhere. I remember the year. I remember it very clearly. And so Nixon was trying to calm that down. And when we get to Kent State is where the National Guard went over the line and opened fire with live ammo on college students protesting the war, killing 4 of them. The head of that National Guard unit, by the way, was the guy who would become the vice president under George H.W. Bush, namely Dan Quayle. He was the one that gave the order to fire. But George Bush came to Richard Nixon, and he came to him in 1970, 71, in that area. And he told Nixon, look, you know, we realize you can't leave the war in Vietnam because we're really there about heroin trafficking. So what we need to do is we need to bomb the area in Vietnam using Agent Orange, to completely defoliate the heroin crop, and then let's get out. And Nixon's going, well, what are we going to do? That heroin market is going to be turned over to somebody, and we've got nothing to fill it. And Bush said, oh, no, we have a methodology that we can do. What we want to do is we want to replace heroin, which is kind of a downer, with cocaine, which is an upper. So we can continue to sell white powder into the market and can maintain productivity of the American worker and control the market entirely if it's in the Western Hemisphere. Ah, well, that's a great idea. So it was the CIA that funded the inception of the cocaine market in Peru and Colombia. And this is where they went down and they brought in the families. They started the crops going. They started the plantations up. They started all the machinations. And then they put in place our friend there in Panama, whose name is slipping my mind right now. I could see his, Manuel Noriega. George Bush puts Manuel Noriega in charge in Panama City, where the money is all going to be laundered and where the cocaine is all going to be trafficked. So the cocaine would be produced in Peru and Colombia, primarily Colombia, shipped into Panama, and it would be stacked up and put in pallets ready for shipping. And then the American U.S. Air Force would fly down to Panama, and there would be payments made in Panamanian banks to the Escobar family and other families. And then that cocaine would be loaded on American aircraft and flown into Mena Air Force Base in Arkansas, which was being overseen by Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was always an agent and a drug peddling captain for GHWB. And so this cocaine would fly into Mena Air Force Base. And then there was a fellow named Don Lasseter, who owned the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain. He had 4 Learjets sitting on the tarmac at Mena Air Force Base, and he would offload all that cocaine onto his Learjets and then fly it all over the country. And this was going on for all 3 terms of Bill Clinton's governorship in Arkansas. And this is how they did it. And so the theory was that George Bush could do this. We could maintain the cocaine traffic all in the Western Hemisphere, and all this profit would then go to the black ops and the intelligence agencies off budget. Now, all this stuff is done off budget, no congressional review. Well, when Reagan gets into office, there was a little problem. There was a communist uprising in Nicaragua under Daniel Noriega, and Reagan wanted to fund the Contras, but the Congress was opposed to that. So he went to George Bush. Now, there was another problem most people don't know about, which was that Jimmy Carter had given a printing press to the Shah of Iran to print $100 bills and had given him the paper that we use for $100 bills. So the Shah was able to print up as much money as he wanted in American cash. This was a gift Jimmy Carter had given to the Shah. And Ronald Reagan wanted that back because the Shah was no longer in power. Instead, Ayatollah Khomeini was in power, and he didn't want him having the ability to print $100 bills. So he tasked George Bush with the idea of go get that printing press back from Iran. So George Bush arranged it through Manuel Noriega to take $600 million out of the bank account of Manuel Escobar, and to take that and give it to the Iranians, then to take that printing press, print up $800 million in counterfeit $100 bills, slip $600 million of counterfeit back into the Escobar bank account, and the other $200 million used for funding the Contras. Now, Admiral Poindexter and what was his name? Anyway, there was another Marine that was involved. I'll think of his name. Oliver North. These two were facilitating this particular transaction of funding the Contras via this mechanism, right? By getting back the printing press. Well, unfortunately, Escobar found out that he had $600 million of counterfeit in his bank because Manuel Noriega told him. And so as a result, George Bush went down and launched an assault using American troops to grab Manuel Noriega so he couldn't talk and to lock him up in a prison where he still is to this day, by the way. And he's spoken to no one because that story, of course, can't get out. And then they, of course, dropped the Hellfire missile on the Escobar family, killing everybody. And so the story went away. The story went away completely. So you have to remember that this is the situation where George H.W. Bush was. And so when we come to the end of the Soviet Union, here's HWB. He's the one reigning. And his son GWB, and at all times, Bill Clinton was his drug captain. So he was still controlling the presidency when Bill and Hillary were the president. Okay? Although Hillary is kind of the loose cannon. She's the spoiled brat that they can't get a handle on. Anyway, and it happened that when it rained, it came to the end also like us the first, so it appeared no more. Of course, Bush's term ran out. That was the end of that. Then came there a voice unto it and said, hear you that have borne rule over the earth for so long. This I say unto you before you begin to appear no more. There shall none after you attain unto your time, neither unto the half thereof. Then arose the third and reigned as the other before and appeared no more also. So went it with all the remnant, one after another. Now, the third that reigned after him would be Donald Trump. The third Republican that reigned after him would be Donald Trump. And did he do a full 8 years? No, he did 4. And he will not be reelected. So went it with all the remnant, one after another, as that everyone reigned, and then appeared no more. So they were reigning and then being pushed out of power. Then I beheld, and lo, in the process of time, the feathers that followed stood up on the right side, that they might rule also. And some of them ruled, but within a while, they appeared no more. For some of them were set up, but ruled not. And after this I looked and beheld, the 12 feathers appeared no more, nor the 2 little feathers. Now, what this is telling you is that this is the end of America. In my opinion, my interpretation on this is that this is the end of the America. The nation appears no more, nor its leaders. Now, let me show you how this is going to play out, because we're going to see something here in this prophecy. And there was no more upon the eagle's body, but 3 heads that rested and 6 little wings. Okay. Now, in my opinion, what this is telling you is that the idea of independent states, 50 independent states, and the concepts of federalism, these things are going to completely disappear. There's no feathers. There's no other governors. The eagle is stripped of those feathers. Why? Because it has become a dictatorship. It's become a singular dictatorship. And all of the state governance that goes on, the ideas of federalism, state houses, state senates, local governments in cities and municipalities and so on, all of those gone. And then I saw also that the 2 little feathers divided themselves from the 6 and remained under the head that was upon the right side. Maybe this is London. For the 4 continued in their place, 2 under Rome, 2 under America. And I beheld, and lo, the feathers that were under the wing thought to set up themselves and to prepare to have the rule. And I beheld, and lo, there was one set up, but shortly it appeared no more. And the second was sooner away than the first. Now, in my opinion, those 2 are going to be the UK and the EU. We'll take over. We'll rule the world. And this is really what's going on right now. The World Economic Forum is at war with the United States. The World Economic Forum wants to depopulate the United States. The World Economic Forum wants to destroy the economy of the United States. The World Economic Forum wants to destroy the US dollar. The World Economic Forum wants to displace the United States as the singular superpower, thinking that it can do it from here. The EU is thinking that, and the UK is thinking that. Now, I don't know if it's going to be the EU that starts out first and then the UK, or the UK and then the EU. But one of the 2 of them are going to rise up and say, we're prepared to take over the stewardship. I think it's the EU, the World Economic Forum. But once it's set up, shortly, it appears no more. It will be gone in a very short period of time. And the second one that tries to take over will be here less than that. But in the meantime, all of these wings are dictatorships. All right. And I beheld, and lo, the 2 that remained thought also in themselves to reign. And when they so thought, behold, there awakened one of the heads that were at rest. Namely, it was in the midst, for that was greater than the 2 other heads. And then I saw that the other 2 heads were joined with it. And behold, the head was turned with them that were with it, and did eat up the 2 feathers under the wing that would have reigned. So what takes place here is that the 3 heads now, DC, London, and Rome, are going to become a finalized dictatorship, and there will be no discrete leadership in these other countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the EU, or the UK. But this head put the whole earth in fear, and bore rule in it over all those that dwelt upon the earth, which much oppression. And it had the governance of the world more than all the wings that had been. Right? The governance of the world more than all the wings that had been, right? A techno-fascist new world order under AI. And after this, I beheld, and lo, the head that was in the midst suddenly appeared no more, like as the wings. But there remained the 2 heads, London, and DC, which also in like sort ruled upon the earth, but over those that dwelt therein. And I beheld, and lo, the head upon the right side devoured the one that was upon the left. Then I heard a voice which said unto me, look before you and consider the thing that you see. And I beheld, and lo, as it were, a roaring lion chased out of the wood. And I saw that he sent out a man's voice unto the eagle and said, here, I will talk with you, and El Elyon shall say unto you, are not you it that remains of the four living creatures, whom I made to reign in my world, that the end of their times might come through them? And the fourth came and overcame all the beasts that were past, and had power over the world with great fearfulness, and over the whole compass of the earth with much wicked oppression. And so long time dwelt he upon the earth with deceit. Okay, let's take a look. The four beasts that he's referring to here, that the lion is referring to, is spoken here in Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Baal-Shazzar, king of Babel, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and the four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted from the earth, and made to stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, I believe, and I think this is what Daniel is talking about. He's talking about Babylon. Babylon, the kingdom represented by a lion with wings. And by the way, there are no lions in Iran or in Iraq, and there never have been. But Babylon is represented by a lion with wings. And where Daniel was at the time of this writing, he was in Babylon. So he begins with the first that was like a lion, but had eagle's wings that reached out. It reached out to control. So you're talking about a central state that reaches out with its wings to control. And it reaches out to control Mitzrayim, and it reaches down to control Yahud. Okay. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side and had three ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said unto it, arise and devour much flesh. Well, here we see the description of the Persian Empire, which would put Assyria, Babylon, and Mitzrayim in its mouth in between its teeth. It would hold the three ribs of those empires. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast also had four heads, and dominion was given to it. Well, this is a perfect description of Alexander the Great's empire. The Greek Empire was the empire of the leopard, and the four wings would be the division of the empire following his death in battle. These were the kingdoms of Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Oh, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the remnant with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So here is a picture of the Council of Laodicea. And I thought this picture was very, very interesting, because we see the bishops gathered here. And when we look at these bishops, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So a picture speaks 1,000 words, or in this case, a picture speaks 10 words. Okay. For the earth have you not judged with truth? For you have afflicted the meek, you have hurt the peaceable, you have loved liars and destroyed the dwellings of them that brought forth fruit, and have cast down the walls of such as did you no harm. Therefore is your wrongful dealing come up unto El Elyon, and your pride unto El. El Elyon also has looked upon the proud times, and behold, they are ended, and his abominations are fulfilled. And therefore appear no more, you eagle, nor your horrible wings, nor your wicked feathers, nor your malicious heads, nor your hurtful claws, nor all your vain body, that all the earth may be refreshed and may return, being delivered from your violence, and that she may hope for the judgment and mercy of him that made her. Okay. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to take this time, if we can. I suspect that there's going to be a number of questions involved with this. And I just want to say before we get to the questions that keep in mind that this is my interpretation of this particular passage, and other interpretations may differ. Okay, you may have an interpretation that's substantially different, and that's okay. Okay. All right, so let's see if we can get some questions. Okay, so Catherine says, interesting. Okay, well, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. All right. All right, let me see if we have any other questions here. Let's see if we can get things going here from a question point of view. Let's see. All right. So while we're waiting for some questions to come up, I kind of want to review this as well, because this last part of the prophecy is prophesying the end to Rome. That's what it's prophesying. It's prophesying the end of this eagle, the end of Rome, the end of the Reich, and all of its situation. Now, it doesn't tell us how it's going to end, but it does predict the end. Now, we did a discussion before, and the discussion we did before was on Ezra 15 and 16, and that may be how this is going to end. Okay. So when we get a chance, we'll go back and look at that. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in here. So Mary has a question here. She says, how significant was the Pope's deposition by General Berthier in 1798? Well, that's kind of significant, and there's lots of people who talk about that prophecy of showing that the Berthier, that you would start the new count on the popes thereafter. But I don't start the counting on the popes until we get to the recreation of the Third Reich. And that begins, I believe, with Pope Pius V. And so I did it if you go back and you look at the Babylonian prophecy that I did in Ezra 16, which is, I think, about a month ago, you'll see that I discussed that issue of the popes and when they were here, okay, and how we count, okay. All right, let's see here. I'm going to keep going on these questions if we got it. Okay, Ezekiel 38, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, all the young lion cubs. Yeah. Did the Vatican create Islam as a needed adversary? Well, it's very interesting when you talk about Islam, because Islam, I think, was a creation. I can't say that the Vatican did it, but you have an act of Yah really taking place that Islam would rise, because Muhammad was, a young man, and quite frankly, I think he was Jewish. I mean, he grew up in Mecca, and Mecca was filled with what was called the Quraysh, which were Jews that were living in Mecca. And he ended up marrying a woman who was 21 years older than him, who was actually a Catholic nun. And she taught him everything. All of his theology came from her. And so if you read the Quran, the first surah is her teaching to Muhammad. And so he reiterates that. But then he goes off on his own. And of course, the Quran takes on its own special aspects, because, of course, Muhammad ended up going to war with the Quraysh. And he came to war out of Medina with the Quraysh, and he personally supervised the beheading of 600 Jews at Mecca. And so you can see you can see what happened. Okay, so Ed Carver asked the questions, how can I substantiate the comments regarding Bush as a Nazi? Well, I was hand-delivered a series of photos that came from Otto Skorzeny, who was the personal bodyguard of Adolf Hitler during World War II, who died in Montana, I believe in 1998. And 2 years before he died, he released his personal photographs. And when he released his personal photographs, one of those has a picture of George Herbert Walker Bush with his father and his mother sitting in their house in Germany. And George Scherf was his real name. Scherf was wearing a Nazi youth uniform. And they came to the United States, and his father, who would take the name Prescott Bush, ended up getting arrested and convicted for funding the Third Reich during World War II through Union Bank. And then he would go on to become a senator, notwithstanding his conviction for funding the Nazis. And George Herbert Walker Bush, in his famous speech on September 11th, 1991, proclaimed the advent of the New World Order. And the New World Order has always been the underscored language for the Reich. In other words, what is the New World Order? It is the rise of the Reich, the Third Reich, that the Third Reich would rise to ascendancy and reign for 1,000 years. And so as a result, you can see, you don't see George H.W. Bush goose stepping, but the stories that go along with H.W. Bush, for instance, Anton LaVey, who was the author of the Satanic Bible, he took his son to a meeting with H.W. Bush and George W. Bush outside of Denver, Colorado. And as part of the satanic ritual, they castrated his son. And I've done a personal interview with this man, who, by the way, is a teacher of the faith and of scripture, and who actually is a very solid person, having come back away from his father. But his father had him castrated to satisfy the satanic ritual that the Bushes were engaged in outside of Denver. It was the son of George H.W. Bush's business partner in Zapata Oil that shot Ronald Reagan in 1982. And the involvement that Bush had in respect of the Kennedy, there's the nature, look, the evidence is just phenomenal. And, he was involved at all times with helping the Reich, and he was involved in building the New World Order, which is covert language for the Reich. That's what he was doing. And he came out and said it publicly in 9/11, 1991. Okay, that's just part of it, but there's a lot more. Okay. Jay Fisher asks, how much longer must we wait? Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know how much longer we must wait. I don't know. I don't have an exact timing on anything. There's lots of people who are saying that this may escalate to nuclear war here in August. That's possible, or it may not. It may go much longer than that. I think that the United States is in a lot of trouble through 2024. But as one person has pointed out, in fact, many people have pointed out, Michael Snyder wrote a piece on it, very eloquent piece, by the way, talking about the Aleph, the Paleo-Hebrew Aleph forming over the United States in April of 2024. Now, I think once the Paleo-Hebrew Aleph forms over the United States, I think judgment over the United States is done. It's finished. So whatever happens between here and there I think is going to be pretty dramatic, because there's a lot of judging going on in the United States right now, and you can see it. And so there's a lot of things happening, a lot of things coming. How much longer must we wait? I don't have the exact answer. Ed Carver asks, who are the seven beasts of Revelation 17 and who is the eighth? You're talking about the seven heads on the beast. Yeah. And I talked about this I did a video on this, Ed, not too long ago, talking about those heads and who they were. And I don't have that right at the top of my head right now, but I'm going to recommend you to, I don't know, might have been 2 or 3 videos back when I talked about that in detail. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. Let's see if we have, the eighth is the son of perdition. Yeah. Okay, so Joyce says, great interpretation, Dr. P. Thank you for presenting this prophecy. Well, thank you for saying so, Joy. I appreciate your support on this. Yeah, USA will be destroyed, but Yasharel will be saved out of it. Yeah, I think so. But the thing is, when we talk about Yasharel, Sherry, we have to talk about what is it to be in Yasharel. And a person has to be, I think it's very important for a person to be obedient to the Ruach HaKodesh in Yasharel. That's a very important part of it, okay? And I'm going to kind of leave it at that. All right, let's see. Ed Carver says there's tons of misinfo. Yeah, there are. There's so much misinformation, Ed, right now because people are scraping and scrambling to try to understand Revelation, right? And this is something that is just going to have to wait. Now, the meaning of 322 visionary vet, this is something that is really not within the province of our teaching, because 322 is going to be some kind of gematric, satanic cabal number that is associated with skull and bones, and that they exalt and lift up. But it's really not particularly relevant in, 322, I suppose if you multiplied 300 times 22, you get 666, right? All right. Okay. Thank you, Super Sounds. Blessings to you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, and Debbie asked me my thoughts on current events. Thank you, Debbie, for asking that question, because we did talk a lot about the current events now, and I'm going to talk about some of these current events. Again, I deal with current events on Radio Free Alaska, on Telegram, 3 days a week, Monday through Wednesday. You can catch me live at 2:00 on Radio Free Alaska. Just join the channel. And when I go over current events, and the current events are moving very quickly. We just went through the Vilnius conference of NATO, and it's having massive political fallout. And what I think is going to happen now is I think Russia is probably going to escalate their side of the war to try to bring an end to Ukraine before we get to the end of August, when the United States is intent upon introducing nuclear-capable F-16s into Ukraine. And when the first F-16 flies in Ukraine, the Russians have said, we will not be able to tell if it's carrying a nuclear weapon or not. And as a consequence, we're going to respond as though we've been attacked with a nuclear weapon. So you figure out what that's going to look like. But that would put an end to the West in a very short period of time. And in fact, it probably put an end to the Northern Hemisphere in a very short period of time. So something to think about. And what I think about in terms of current events, there's much unfolding right now. And one of the things I want to mention here on this program is I'm going to begin to take a much more strident position against white genocide. And it seems that there are many, many people who are engaged in establishing the doctrine. They're establishing the intellectual foundation to engage in white genocide. And this has been going on. The news media has been doing it. Hollywood's been doing it. The president's been doing it, and other countries are doing it, as if the United States is an apartheid nation being run by a white minority over a majority of people who are non-white. And this kind of discussion that's going on, the demonization of masculinity, the demonization of men, and the demonization of white Europeans in particular, and the targeting of white Europeans. If you go to the Deagle report, you'll see that white European nations are being targeted for substantial population reductions between now and 2025. That's what they're being planned. That's what the plan is by these world leaders. And, we're going to start speaking out against white genocide, and we're going to be taking it into an international coalition. And this is going to be an international coalition speaking against white genocide. And we're going to start calling out all of the intellectual garbage that's being spewed as to why whites deserve to die, and that whites don't have rights, and whites shouldn't have rights, and whites need to be ashamed of being white, and so on and so forth. All of this kind of stuff has to be called out, and the people who are promoting this stuff have to be condemned, because if we do not condemn it, then they're going to have a impetus that remains unanswered. Well, we have a reason to kill you. No, you don't. Yeah, we did. We said this. Well, that's not true. Well, why didn't you say something 2 years ago? Why didn't you say something 10 years ago? Well, we have to start saying it now. Okay. All right. And so one other thing on Esdras, people are kind of confused about the Esdras. 2 Esdras is the name of the book that's published in most apocryphal collections, 2 Esdras. When we looked at the book, it was known as 2 Esdras, 3 Esdras. No, it was known as 2 Esdras, 4 Esdras, 5 Esdras, and even 6 Esdras. It was known as all of those. And we concluded that Ezra, that wrote the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, was the same Ezra writing 3 Ezra and 4 Ezra, or 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras. So we label them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st Esdras is 3 Ezra, 2nd Esdras is 4 Ezra. So that's how we have it. Okay. Okay. Ezra, 2 Ezra, 3 Ezra, 4 Ezra. There it is, speaking the truth. Thank you. Okay. Okay, guys. So with that, I want to thank you for your questions. Thank you for participating in the chat. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. And I hope you will promote this video. And remember us when you're thinking about getting your set of scriptures to come on over at Cepher Publishing Group, visit us and pick up a set. Okay. All right, brothers and sisters, blessing to you. Blessings to you. May Yah carry you and comfort you and keep you in all things at all times. And may he find you faithful when he comes back to find us. Okay. Fear not, only fear Yahweh. There it is. Okay. Thank you, Alicia. Okay. Blessings and bye-bye.